Hey, good afternoon or good morning, depending on what part of the world you're in, or maybe even good evening if you're joining us from across the ocean. We're going to give it a minute for everyone's AI note takers to join, as well as for the humans. Uh, get 50-50 bet if we get, I bet we actually will have more AI note takers from people who registered but ended up not being able to attend. And I don't know how I feel about that. If there's more AI than more humanity on the call. But so while we're letting all that compute load, grab yourself a Diet Coke, a coffee, a tea, or whatever your beverage of choice is. And we'll get started in just a minute here. All right. Make sure I just got everyone admitted. Yeah. All right, folks. I think we'll get started. I know more people will be joining and more AI bots will be joining too as we get going. My name is Frank Jaskulke. I'm your VP of Sales and Business Development here at Avio Medtech, and I really appreciate you joining me today for a presentation on the 10 most common mistakes that I've seen medtech startups make over the years. I'm going to go through a presentation, but a couple of notes as we go through it. One, you will get the recording, you will get the slides. It's usually the most common question we get. Second, if you have questions at any point, drop them into the chat. I found chat is way easier to use than the Q&A. You don't have to wait till the end. Throw it in there. I'll be monitoring it. I may not get to it immediately as I'm jumping back and forth, but throw your questions in the Q&A at any point. And then when we get to the end of it, we'll have probably a little bit more time, take some additional questions, and then get you on your way. Final thing I'll ask, if there are topics or people or organizations you'd like to hear from that would help you in your journey, please send us a note, let us know. We're always looking for ideas, and the only things we care about putting on are the things you care about learning. So with that, let me go hit the share and we'll jump into the presentation. Right. And let me just move my screen over so that I can see all you fine folks as stuff comes up. Sorry, I got too many screens. Here we go. All right. And again, as you have questions, just dump them into the chat and I'll pull them right up. Here's what we're going to talk about. These are the most common mistakes that in the 20 years I've been doing this, I see companies make. I'm going to go through each one and I'm going to tell you briefly what it is and what you could do to try to avoid or mitigate or reduce the impact of it. And just a big caveat to start out, you're all professionals, right? You do this stuff, you know it. There's a lot of things you do know. Also, these are my observations. These are things I've learned over the years, but I'm not one of you. I'm not the one in the trenches doing it. But even with all that said, even Michael Jordan, he practices dribbling, he practices free throws. No matter how many times you've done this, it is always good to refresh, recharge, and make sure you're developing your skills. First one we're going to talk about, and the thing that is probably the single most common challenge that I see, and that is failure to validate there's actually a market. I worked with, and over my career, have worked with a lot of technical founders, scientists, engineers, clinicians, nurses, people who know the clinical problem, the technology space very well. And a common challenge they run into is confusing a clinical problem and a business problem. There are lots and lots of issues in healthcare for which we don't have a solution, not because the science doesn't exist, but because there hasn't been a way to make a business that can be sustainable. Right. So, yes, you need to have an unmet clinical need. That is fundamental, but it's necessary, not sufficient. There also needs to be a business case that if you solve this clinical problem, you could get paid for it. You could have a sustainable business. And even with all of that, that needs to be a large enough market that if you do solve it and if you do get paid for it, you can make enough money to reinvest in the business, generate a return for investors, or whatever the goals might be. So what do? The thing you can do really early on, optimally, you would do this when you have an idea, before you have a product, before you have a prototype. Talk to all the stakeholders, and I mean all, right? If you have a surgical device, it's not just the docs using it, it's the nurses in the OR, it's the hospital administrators, the practice unit leaders, the hospital CFO, and the payers who all have an influence on the use and adoption of your product. Get their inputs, understand their needs. Second thing, third-party validation is really helpful. If you go and talk to all the stakeholders, you potentially are going to bias the input, right? You love your idea, or I hope you do. You believe in the problem you're solving. That bias can get introduced into the discussion. So getting third-party help can really help reduce some of that bias and make sure you get inputs that are useful. And then finally, understand workflow. We'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, but like, does your product fit into existing workflow? Does it change a workflow? Does it create a new workflow? Those are very different business problems to solve with different complications and different challenges along the way. Excuse me. Let me just check the chat, make sure. Ah, great question from Nicole about talking to patients. Yes, it is very important to talk to the patients, right? They are another one of the stakeholders. And I think sometimes because we're working in healthcare, where often we're selling the product to a hospital, it's getting paid for by a payer. We know the patients matter, but the way they interact with the product, of course, is very important. So yes, definitely one of the stakeholders. Thank you for calling that out, Nicole. Second most common mistake I see is people and mission getting aligned. Uh, Startups are hard. You all know that. They are prone to failure. There's a lot of risk. They're a ton of work. They're even harder and they're even more likely to fail if you don't have a great team in place and if they aren't aligned around the common goal. I see a lot of startups that spend a lot of time and money on doing things that don't advance the mission. Why? Usually it's they have a team of people who maybe know their domains, but don't know the journey of a startup to create value. And so they might know R&D and they do R&D, but they don't know how to choose between to do a test A or test B that would most advance the business milestones. Usually what you end up seeing is they spread like peanut butter. They do bunches of things, but they aren't really moving it forward. Ultimately, when you get to the point of trying to raise capital, this will really come to bite you. First thing investors are going to look at, if they're professionals, is going to be the quality of the team. If the team isn't there, the technology and the market are going to get discounted immensely. If the team is A plus, they'll look past a lot of challenges in the market and the technology because they'll believe that that team can execute and create value. So what do? You got to make sure you get great people, but great people who are suited for the mission at hand. And if you're the CEO of a startup, one of the really hard things here is that you may be suited for the mission today and not suited for the mission later. Understanding where your gaps are and knowing where you might need to step back, change your role, do something different is really important if you're committed to that technology getting into market and helping patients. Third one, and talking my own book here a little bit, but I see companies go cheap on regulatory, and usually this happens when they get really focused on getting to market authorization, but they're not thinking about market adoption. They're very different things, right? Getting FDA clearance or approval gives you the legal ability to sell. It doesn't mean anyone will buy. Just like you're doing that market validation work early, I would hope you're also doing regulatory work early, not doing heavy duty work, but understanding what does the market need in order to adopt your product, right? What are the market requirements? How might that translate into claims that you need to make? And then for those claims, what sort of regulatory approach is best? 510K may be faster, But 510K with some clinical studies may be faster to getting to market adoption and ultimately create more value at a lower total cost. You should be integrating all of that work that you do up front to figure out what's the appropriate regulatory strategy, not what's the fastest, cheapest to be legally on market. Related to that, I see this happen so much where companies have insufficient evidence and they will just say, trust me, it works, it's better. And this is scientists, engineers, doctors, but because it's their product, their innovation, they know it works. We would never accept this from someone else. If a doctor came to you and said, I have no proof that this is better, but you should do it, we might rightfully question what they're recommending. If you are developing a new medical device, you should determine, and this is where that market validation work really is helpful, what evidence is needed by your stakeholders in order to drive adoption. If you haven't met that level of evidence, then you shouldn't be surprised if you're having a hard time raising money or making sales, right? Don't forget, you're not the only company out there. There are thousands of other companies, including often hundreds that are doing similar things or solving similar problems as you are. How do you stand out? By having high quality evidence that meets the needs of the market. That doesn't always mean clinical studies. It might be white papers, it might be bench testing, it might be reports, right? But figuring out what evidence the market requires and then meeting that standard is going to leave you in a better position to drive adoption. Many companies nowadays are connected, they have software, they involve data. This has always been important. It's even more important, right? Everything is so connected now that a minor security issue can turn into a major security issue. If your product is a weak point, hackers will find it and they will get in. But also, once you're commercial, if you have a connected product or a data-driven product, you're going to have to go through these security audits and verifications with pretty much every customer you sell to over and over and over again. If early on you've done the work to engineer security into your product, to build good documentation, to have good processes, you're going to sell faster. You're going to save weeks or potentially even months on your sales cycle by doing that right work early on. If you skip by it, then you try to fix it later, you're going to over and over and over again have to solve that problem in those security audits, slow down your sales cycle, extend the time it takes you to get paid, lower the terminal value of your company. And I mentioned workflow briefly earlier, and this is where it really comes in. Change is hard. And I think entrepreneurs, by your nature, you're optimistic, right? You believe there can be something better. That doesn't change, though. That change is hard. If in the new year you've ever tried to build a new habit, you want to eat better or exercise or whatever it might be, you know how hard it is to change. Now imagine you're a surgeon who's done a procedure a certain way for decades. You're a hospital that has invested millions of dollars in equipment and processes and team. And then a little startup they've never heard of shows up and says, you should change. It can be better. Trust me, right? No matter what, change will always take longer and cost more than you expect. What I've learned over the years from many of you is that there are two fundamental strategies to break through. One is to be very nichey, solve a pain point that even if it's not big, it's very noticeable and you really solve it and that becomes your wedge in. Or you need to be truly big, truly transformative change where making the change is worthwhile, right? Like it's big enough to put in the effort, put in the work because the payoff is worth it. If you're an incremental improvement on a small problem, that's a hard spot to be in. Related to that, I see a lot of teams, especially if they haven't done commercial programs before, underestimate the cost of sales. Like R&D is expensive, R&D is complex, sales is even more expensive. Really great sales reps, they make really great money. And often you want them to make great money, right? If they do well, your company does well. If you're going through distributors, they got to pay their bills. They need a cut, often 20, 30, 40, 50%, right? And then you have logistics and shipping. And don't forget about the cost of just carrying inventory. You got to make your product. You got to pay the manufacturer, hold it in a warehouse. You pay the warehouse. You finally make a sale, and then the hospital tells you, oh, yeah, you're on net 120-day terms. It is entirely possible that early on in your sales cycles, it might take 6 to 9 months or longer to go from making product to getting the cash back to pay for the product, right? You need to have enough cash just to survive that time to get the sales going. So what do you need to do? This is where the limited market release really comes in. Oh, and I'm going to pause here. I'm sorry, I just saw a question. Um, Question is SOC 2 mandatory to enter in a health facility? If you have a connected device or a device that is moving data, especially PHI or personal health information, some level of security, whether it's SOC 2, high trust, or both, are going to be required, and your customers are likely going to require you to demonstrate that you've met those standards, and that you can work in their systems without creating new risks. So yes, like not mandatory in the legal sense, but mandatory in the customer is going to ask for proof in some way, and you better be prepared to meet it. Thank you. Great question. So limited market release. This is the idea that you can lower your initial cost of sales and lower your risk of failure by being very focused on how you launch. So limited market release, the idea is you target one doc or one hospital or one market, something very focused. Almost no company actually does like a US market release. And for our international audience, this is a really important thing. You may have launched in Norway or Spain or Denmark. You've effectively launched in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and maybe Pennsylvania, right? The US being so physically large, such a large population, such a big market, even the big giant companies often take a very focused launch or focused release for their first product or for a new product. Why do you do this? Not only is it lower cost to start, but you're going to make mistakes. You will fail in some way. There will be things you didn't anticipate, things you got wrong. You don't want to be wrong with 50 reps in the field and $100 million spent. You want to be wrong with one rep, maybe even yourself, and one customer. You learn from that mistake, you improve, you sell another product, you make a new mistake, you learn from that, you improve, you hire a second rep, you go to a second market, you make new mistakes, but fewer because you learned from the first one. And as you go, reinvesting, you're taking the knowledge to make the next rep more productive, faster, ramp rate. And you eventually get to a point where you have a well-defined sales playbook. You know what problems to avoid. You know how to get through the value analysis committees. You've now got a well-oiled machine, time to pour gas, AKA time to get lots of money, hire the sales team, go aggressive. You want to do that small, then big, not big, then fail. Of course, to do that, you need capital. And usually, the first thing I hear when I talk to a startup is they're like, hey, we're broke. We're trying to raise money. In Avio's world, all of our customers are somewhere between broke and about to be broke. And that's the world we like to work in. It's challenging, it's fun. You all have to be very creative, right? Medtech is expensive. You know you're going to need capital. I don't have any magic wands or solutions here, but one problem I have seen over and over again is I'll see companies who maybe they need 5 million, but they're only raising a million, or they need 20 million and they're raising half a million. They're like, how much money can I get now? What can I do to just barely scrape by? And I get it. There are situations where you need to do a bridge round, and that is the appropriate strategy, or where you need to do a smaller round. Totally fine. But I see so many companies where they know they need more capital, and if they don't get that more capital, there is no path forward. And then they go and raise too little money. What happens? That money doesn't advance the business. The business doesn't hit a next milestone. They can't raise the next round. And all they've done is now destroy more investor capital, make it harder for them to raise the next round, right? Raising money is hard, it's high risk. Startups have a high failure rate. It's hard, but scraping by sometimes is actually less productive than simply saying, this isn't right. We need to stop. We need to retool. Maybe we need to even shut it down. Related to that, I talked with a lot of companies who are going after venture capital that are not venture backable, right? Like venture capital as an investment vehicle is one asset class, and it has very specific requirements for the kind of businesses it invests in, the amount of capital it deploys, and the returns it seeks. If you don't fit those profile, you shouldn't waste your time going after the venture capital funds. Doesn't mean you're not financeable, right? There are other ways of financing the company, but understand that venture capital generally wants to invest in companies that have very large markets, teams that can execute and grow extremely rapidly, and then get to an exit, usually in med device, to a strategic in a roughly 5-year window, right? If your business doesn't fit that profile, don't waste your time on the venture capital, right? Talk to angels, talk to strategics, go after grants, find cheaper ways to get to market and generate revenue. But understand that venture capital is not the only source of investor capital. And if your company doesn't fit it, don't waste your time, don't waste their time on it. Related to that, this gets back to the team piece, but um, sometimes we're not in the right seat. The job we're doing today is maybe not the job we should do. There are a lot of startups I talk to where the team that is out raising the money doesn't project credibility. And I see this show up in a lot of ways, and I just want to talk about credibility for a moment. Many of the things investors look for are about objective truth, about facts, about data. But ultimately, a lot of investment decisions get made on credibility. Do I believe that if I give you money, you'll generate a return? I can't prove you will. If I could, it wouldn't be risk capital. So I need to believe that you will do it. There are lots of things, subtle and not subtle, that you can do to project credibility or destroy credibility. There are simple ones, like I see decks that have errors in them all the time or that are old or have out of date information. That doesn't help. Second, I see teams all the time where the team clearly does not know what they're doing. They don't understand the market they're in. They can't tell you how they're going to get to exit. They aren't credible themselves. And then there are things where it's clear that they're trying to raise money from the wrong parties. But understand that when you're going to raise capital, you're selling, right? You're selling equity in the company. The customer is the investor. They need credibility. Yes, they will need facts and truth. They will want to do diligence, but there are so many deals that happen because a person believed another person could do something, or a person they trust believes that you can do something and they'll follow along. Then we get into reimbursement, right? If you've raised the money, you built the product, you got to get the reimbursement. You need to be able to pay for what you're doing. Um, the thing that I see a lot though with reimbursement is it gets done too late, optimally, right when you're doing market validation work, right when you're looking at regulatory. You would also be looking at reimbursement and understanding, is there a way for what you're doing to be paid for? Or if not, what will you have to do to change that? Right? It all connects when you get to reimbursement because the payers are going to look at your claims, they're going to look at your FDA clearance or approval, they're going to look at your evidence, and they're going to want to know, does it meet our standards for the kinds of things we pay for? And guess what? The payers actually, they'll tell you the stuff they currently pay for. It's on their websites, medical policies. So what you need to start with is clinical proof, right? Like first and foremost, they want to pay for things that improve outcomes in some way, but recognize but that's a starting point. It's not sufficient, right? And I'll just leave you with a fun fact about some of the payer industry. United Health Group, bigger than the entire US medical device industry, so is Aetna. They really, really focus on clinical proof because economic proof is hard when you're so big and they need hundreds of billions of dollars of value to move the needle, right? If you're working in a market that's $1 billion market, your improvement in that space is unlikely to change the margins at a United Health Group. So they're actually going to really focus on, is there clinical improvement? If you can show that and then demonstrate, hey, economically, this has some value, you're going to have a much better shot of getting through with the payers. So work on solutions with a big enough impact, clinically and economically, to get the interest of the payers. But even more importantly, just do the work early on to understand what is required so that you can hopefully fit into some existing reimbursement. Don't wait until the end to figure this stuff out. And with that, I'll stop talking at you and say thank you so much for listening to me share a little bit of what I've learned from many of you over the years. I'll take any questions you might have, any suggestions. And again, we will send out the recording, we'll send out the notes, and you can always reach out afterwards if you want to chat. I'm going to stop sharing and just move the screen back over to the main thing so I can see you all. If you have questions, just go ahead, drop them into the chat, and I'll start answering them. And if you don't have questions, hey, don't worry. Clinda, I hear you. Yeah, these are challenges you have probably been through before in your career, right? Oh, thank you, Gabriel. Very nice. I'm glad it is resonating with folks. Thank you. I'll just let you know because I've been in sales so long, I'm really good at just waiting. If you have questions, go for it. And if not, all right. We will wrap it up, folks. Thank you so much for taking your time with me today. You'll get the recording right after this. And if you have any questions for your own company or things we might help with, reach out anytime. We're always at your service. Have a great rest of your day. See you, folks.